I've covered the concept of tradition, trying to clarify it and its meaning within religions such as Catholicism. But I wanted to elaborate just a little bit on written versus oral transmission and the common attempts to oppose written and oral transmission, which is to say scripture and tradition. In the West, tradition, that term is sometimes used in this limited way to refer specifically to orally transmitted doctrine as opposed to the scriptures or other written forms of transmission. And I've mentioned this in some of my other videos on the meaning of tradition, but to differentiate themselves from Catholics, Protestants, or non-Catholic Christians, groups might say that they accept scripture but not tradition. You know, I've heard that many times, and by this they mean that they reject whatever doctrine they cannot find explicitly stated in the Bible. Now, ignoring all of the obvious difficulties and contradictions inherent in this position, I only want to say here in this video, which is hopefully much shorter than my others, is that this notion of tradition itself is not valid, that it's a false dichotomy, and that in the very opposition, it misunderstands what tradition means. And I've noted already etymologically that tradition, the word, simply means that which is transmitted. And so for us Catholics, and really all traditional or Eastern civilizations, the idea of tradition embraces both written and oral forms of transmission. The attempts of Protestants to prefer one means or one form over the other would not be taken seriously by any traditional religion, because the distinction in question is artificial. Moreover, because most doctrines are orally transmitted first and placed in written form later, Christianity is no exception. Christian scriptures are, in a sense, the product or crystallization of a pre-existing oral tradition, without which they could not have come into being. In other words, oral transmission typically precedes written transmission. For this reason, if we were going to place them in some sort of a contrived hierarchy where one is more important than the other, we would have to say that oral transmission has a kind of primacy, at least in time, and was the only mode utilized by the founder of Christianity himself. Christ was a speaker, a teacher. And although, again, I'm not trying to insist on this point as if I really want to present one as more legitimate than the other, oral as more legitimate than written, pitting them against each other. That's something I have no intention of doing, and that's precisely what I'm trying to disentangle. But if, again, the primacy mentioned is more about historical and logical order of things. So the attempts of Protestants to deny the legitimacy of oral transmission, that should be taken as an expression of the underlying egalitarian individualism of the Reformation. And I will try to explain that a lot more elsewhere, of why that is, why it is an expression of a certain mentality and less than a logical conclusion. But like the modern world in general, this egalitarian individualistic impulse insists on reducing everything to its simplest form, rejecting all that's subtle, all that requires submission to an authority, all that is of a supra-individual character, and only accepting what can be seen, touched, and easily grasped by the population, in general. Everything must be made democratic. In a sense, you could say that the Reformation was ahead of its time by democratizing, in the worst possible way, Christian doctrine, regardless of what is always destroyed in the process. Any leveling destroys whatever cannot be reduced to generalities. So this inability to appreciate the supra-individual nature of the Christian church as one body of so many persons is also apparent in the demand that each book of the Bible be attached to a single author, for example, even when it's clear that scripture in question was not authored by anyone in particular. So you can browse my other videos for elaboration on some of these points, and I'll try to follow up soon.